Alright, this is going to be a video about my take on what caused the Civil War of the 1860s. This is kind of a follow-up to all the interest that there's been in secession recently, and that, of course, causes people to look back to the most dramatic example. Of course, it's not the only example, but the most well-known example of secession movement in the United States. That's, of course, the so-called, and I'd say misnamed, Civil War. Now, I'm going to qualify all this as saying I don't think there's a whole lot that we can learn about how a current secessionist movement might play out in the United States by looking at what happened in the 1860s. Like I said, the government is completely different. The society is completely different. Or not completely different, but very, very different. The context is different. So many variables are different that it's interesting to look at, and there might possibly be parallels, probably a few, at least in a very, very broad way. But just to think that it would give us any indication of how it's going to play out, I think is unwarranted. But it's still a very, very interesting question, and it's pertinent because the Civil War is used as a rhetorical device currently in political discourse, and what its causes were, how it played out, is relevant to those discussions. Basically, the way the Civil War comes across now is, I think the number one reason really is sort of not that political, but it's the martyrdom and the basically deification of Abraham Lincoln, who is probably at this point the most acclaimed president that we've ever had. For a long time, I think George Washington had that position or was up there, and FDR is usually considered number 3 on the list. And this is not the libertarian list of great presidents, by the way, but just in mainstream historical understanding, Lincoln has been elevated, and I think part of that is that by elevating him, they are also elevating the federal government. And this is the first instance of the federal government taking on the role of social reformer. Prior to the Civil War, it basically had a function. Of course, that could be called a social function, but it was in a position where it was supposed to do certain tasks, and it wasn't really supposed to intervene in society. And even after the Civil War, the federal government didn't do that much of that sort of intervention, more than it had previously, but nothing compared to what we've since become used to. But this is the first kind of example of it going out and changing society. The cliche is that it went out on a crusade to end slavery, which is not really true. I mean, eventually it did pass the 13th Amendment, but that was well after the fact, when the war was already basically won. That was not the casus belli. That was not the reason the war happened. And this is why questions about why the Civil War did happen are really pertinent, because there are a whole cluster of myths surrounding the motivations and justifications for the war. And it is a complex question, and so it is valuable to know about it and to be able to say, well, it's not really true. The federal government has not been the progressive social crusading institution that it is pretended to be. The war was not launched and largely won on the idea of, say, setting men free or making men equal. There were people who did have that motivation. Abraham Lincoln, perhaps slightly, although not nearly as much as all the other abolitionists. He was not an abolitionist by his own stance and by theirs, but for some reason he is, well, not for some reason, because of the war and because of his death, he is now basically considered to be that. So, also I have a number of subscribers from the UK, and they've kind of asked me, they don't really know anything about the Civil War. It's poorly understood in the States. I'm sure it's even less well understood in the UK. Civil wars tend to have to be very, very particular. You know, whatever that society, the aspects of that society seem to have a big role in it. And there's a tendency for people in outside societies to graft their own political struggles onto it. So like the Civil War in Spain, which was very, very specific to Spain, it had a dynamic that was quite unique to that country, became, in most people's eyes, you know, a battle between fascism and communism, or Hitler and Stalin, or right versus left, or church versus secularism, or people grafted their own conflicts onto that one, and that's actually pretty common. So the cliched answer that most people believe, that most people think, was that the Civil War is caused by slavery. Now that's not usually exactly the version that is taught in school, and I think most serious historians would, even ones that I would disagree with about, say, their estimation of someone like Lincoln, would not say that the Civil War was just caused by slavery, although I think probably some of them would. On the other hand, there's kind of this thing in libertarians circles to say, well, really the Civil War was about tariffs. And I don't think that's true either. Tariffs were a big issue in the 19th century. We didn't really have any tariffs until the War of 1812. And once they were instituted, classic case, it was instituted as a war measure, but then the industries that were benefiting from it suddenly formed a lobby and a constituency that perpetuated them and made them greater. And then, of course, the industries that were protected became the envy of industries that were not protected, and so the non-protective industries started lobbying for their own. Anyway, tariffs were a very contentious issue throughout the 19th century. On net, tariffs detracted from the wealth of the South and enriched the North, and there was a lot of tensions, and I think they got their hottest in the 1830s. That's when South Carolina basically threatened to stop enforcing the tariff, and President Jackson said that he would kill them all if they didn't enforce it, basically. And he was the kind of person who did not make many empty threats, or at least the threat of him not having to be a bluff was enough to scare them off. Although in the end, they said, okay, we won't nullify, but then the tariff was reduced and even eliminated. So there's kind of a compromise there. By the 1860s, obviously tariffs were still a big issue. It was still a thorn in the craw of many Southerners, but it was not the main reason that they left. And to sum up, I think the reason that they left was ideology, mostly, and that the ideology, the principle in question here, was that of states' rights. The election of Abraham Lincoln is the spark, so to speak, that causes secession. The idea that secession was about defense of slavery is partially correct, but it's not the actual reason, because the federal government took no action to eliminate slavery in the South, ever, that I'm aware of. Certainly Lincoln never did before the war, and he was explicit in his promise that he would never try. His famous, I think it's his first inaugural address, where he says, if I could keep the Union and free the slaves, I'd do that. If I could keep the Union and not free any slaves, I would do that. And if I could, keep the Union by freeing some slaves and not freeing other slaves, I would do that also. Basically, whatever his views on slavery were, which his abolitionism is greatly exaggerated, but he did have qualms about slavery. I don't think that it's right to pretend otherwise. Whatever his reservations were, his desire to maintain the, quote, Union was an overriding priority above and beyond whatever he may have felt about slavery. I think he was against slavery, by the way, but he was also, especially by today's standards, extremely racist. These may not be his personal beliefs, but just him bowing to the political realities of where he was from. Basically, the politics of Illinois, and actually most of the North, were extremely anti-black. One of the reasons they basically would ban freemen from even being in the state in a lot of cases. And if you read about emancipation in, say, New England, it's kind of like, well, they can't be privately owned slaves, but they would still basically be locked into the criminal justice system, indentured. This is something that I didn't know about, but I read a whole book called, what was it called? It's about emancipation in New England. But basically, the cities and municipalities would take the blacks and be like, oh, well, they're delinquent, and they would basically make them work to pay off their legal fees. Anyway, it was his election that really got the South going. And what it was about his election that made them upset wasn't that he was about to end slavery, but it was a demonstration of the political powers, the potential political powers of the forces against them. Lincoln was not on the ballot in 10 southern states, and yet he was still elected president. And what this was a signal that the South was a minority, which everyone is a minority given if we pick our issues right, and that the potential was there for the federal government to be beyond their control and to potentially do anything it wanted. Now, it hadn't tried to do anything other than these tariffs. It had tried to stop the spread of slavery, but it had done nothing to end slavery where it already existed, and that was the explicit promise of Lincoln. It wasn't in the platform of the Republican Party to do anything about ending slavery until 1864, which is well after the fact. But I think what they recognize is the principle that, hey, we are a minority within the political system, which, by the way, was fairly well geared toward, well, not fairly well, but made specific attempts to protect minorities. They were still at a political disadvantage. And many people in the South decided, and when I say many people, among the political class, the South has its own political classes that are not wholly laudatory, certainly. They decided, well, we're in a situation where we are a minority, where we don't have the political clout to defend ourselves from a potential onslaught, and so we should end this political relationship. Now, the issue that they were most worried about was slavery. It's not to say that it was about to happen. Like I say, abolitionists did not have a ton of political power even within the North, maybe in Massachusetts, maybe in a few other states, but the idea that abolition was going to sweep the country is very, very unlikely. But in principle, it could have happened, and that's only one issue. It could have been the tariff, it could have been any number of other things. Basically, if you realize that you are in the minority of an electorate, then even if nothing has happened yet, any thinking person has to come to the realization, well, this is only a matter of time before the majority starts doing something that I'm not going to like, and I'm not going to have the electoral clout to stop them. And so maybe I shouldn't be involved with this electorate. And that is essentially what the initial seceding states did. The Deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida basically had to do whatever Georgia's decided. Now then there was a second wave of secession that was also based on ideology, and this was a reaction to what Abraham Lincoln did to this secession movement. Basically, Abraham Lincoln said, I'm not going to allow secession, and he called for an army to be raised. And at this point, many southern states, about half of the Confederacy or the eventual Confederacy, said, well, we weren't really interested in seceding, but if you were going to use force, if you were going to coerce those states that wish to leave into staying in the Union, not only do we not want to actively help you, which is what they would have been asked to do, we are now so upset with your behavior that we also are going to leave. And of course, the most important state here by far was Virginia. Virginia was the most industrialized state. It was pretty much the only state in the South that had any kind of industry, really. And this kind of also forced the states south of there, like North Carolina and Tennessee, into a position where it was easier for them to secede. And it's likely this increased the military viability of the South probably more than double, probably triple or quadrupled it, which, as it happened, it was still not enough. But and so they did not secede because of slavery or because they were worried that slavery would be ended. They were seceding because of ideology, because they recognized quite correctly that a federal government that is going to enforce its rule over people via coercion is a tyranny. And I mean, the South was trying to leave peacefully, and this is something that I think is it's not really debatable, but it's not really appreciated either. There's kind of this thing that the war just starts, and there's this vague concept that the South is somehow guilty for this. Secession is perfectly understandable thing for people to do. It is not an aggressive act. To disassociate with somebody, especially if you're only doing that disassociation in the political realm. You know, there's no evidence that the South is saying we don't want to trade with the North anymore. We don't want to be friends. They had family. They didn't want to become isolated, polar opposite societies. They just wanted to have a political separation. And this is why, of course, the Civil War is misnamed, because in the Civil War you have competing elements that are both trying to rule over the entire state. No one in the South was thinking about taking over the North. There were people in the South who were thinking about taking over other areas in Latin America and Mexico. I don't think that was a very serious contention, but there were Alexander Hamilton types in the South too, who were imagining basically a Latin American empire that's being ruled by this Anglo-American southern United States. Obviously, those plans never even approached fruition, but none of them were thinking, okay, we're going to secede and then we're going to invade the North and take the North over and rule the North, you know, with an iron fist. It's not a case of a minority taking over a majority government in the name of becoming a hegemon over it. The South seceded. I don't know all the details, but basically they told the federal government, you have bases here, specifically several forts along the coast. You know, this is our territory now. So South Carolina offered to pay to buy these areas back. You know, we'll take care of the costs. We don't want to inhibit you too much. But please leave. This is our country now. It's not yours any longer. And basically, Abraham Lincoln said, no, absolutely not. And eventually, they said, okay, fine, well, if you're not going to leave, we're going to force you out. And that is the Battle of Fort Sumter, which Lincoln was hoping for. There's a great lecture called The Cost of War, given by John Dennison at the Mises Institute. I have it in my favorites list, but I have so many videos in my favorites list, I doubt you can find it. If anyone's really interested, I highly recommend it. He analyzes both the start of the Civil War and the start of World War II. Basically the idea that Roosevelt and Lincoln both wanted to be seen as the victim of an aggressive antagonist. In the case of FDR, that was Germany and Japan. In the case of Lincoln, it was the South. He presents evidence that this is what they were thinking. Lincoln basically was telling people that we need them to do something that we can blame as an attack, and that's exactly what it was, how it was portrayed in the North. I think that there were a lot of Northerners who were against secession and who saw this as, but at the same time, we're not so against it to say, okay, they're seceding, so let's just, launch a major invasion of the South. It was more, we need some kind of reason to show that these people are deserving of our martial spirit, and Fort Sumter served that end, even though nobody died except for a Confederate horse. So Lincoln was able to launch a war, and again, the motivation of almost all Northerners was to preserve the Union, to suppress the rebellion. There were some, obviously, who were motivated by abolitionist proclivities. The most famous example probably is someone like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He gives a great speech in the movie Gettysburg, which it's written by the author of the screenwriters of that movie, or maybe even Michael Shaw, the author of the book that movie's based on. It's a very eloquent speech about how this is an army to set men free, and we're here to make the world better, and equality, and blah, blah, blah. And it's bullshit in the sense that that's not why most people were fighting, but it's not bullshit in the sense that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is one of the few people who probably would have been motivated that way. He had been actually going to college with Madeline Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and probably even had read drafts of it before it was published. He probably did feel that way, but he was exceptional in lots of ways, and certainly in his motivation for fighting for the Union Army. The Union Army was out to end the rebellion. Things like the Emancipation Proclamation were intended as war measures. They weren't intended to free all the slaves. It's been pointed out so many times that it specifically did not free slaves in areas that the North controlled, in border states, in northern states where slavery was still allowed or at least practiced, and even in parts of the South that had been conquered. Specifically, a number of parishes in Louisiana that had fallen into federal hands in the spring of 1862. Slavery was not abolished. So these are the areas where the federal government actually had the power, the physical coercive means to enforce an Emancipation Proclamation, and they explicitly didn't. And so they were basically calling for the freedom of slaves that they didn't actually, it didn't free any slaves. It'd be like them making a proclamation to free all the slaves in Thailand or Siam. It didn't do anything. Later in the war, there was definitely a shift towards 13th Amendment, ending slavery kind of in the aftermath of the war, which was becoming apparent at that point. And, I don't know how much of this was due to soul searching, how much of this was due to we're having war weariness, we have to have a reason to justify all of this. We can't say that we have this huge war and the only thing that it's done is put us back in square one. The idea being they're seceding, we're going to make them stay. So the end of the war is we haven't gained new territory, we haven't done anything, we're back where we started. It's pretty easy to imagine that psychologically that was probably not the most appealing end to such an enormously bloody conflict. Still, the worst conflict in American history in terms of casualties of Americans. I don't think that Lincoln deserves to be considered the worst president because more Americans died. I think FDR gets to be considered the worst president because more people died. And he was monumentally more deceitful than Abraham Lincoln, which is saying a lot. Let me just say something real quick here about Lincoln. Lincoln is one of the few figures where there's room to be mixed. Lincoln wasn't some angel. He was corrupt like most politicians. He had political positions that were pragmatic and not necessarily that principled. At the same time, I don't think he wanted to be a tyrant. I don't think that he was eager to use the presidency to immortalize himself in a way that someone like FDR was. FDR was always ever thinking about his legacy, how he would be perceived. He wanted to be seen as a great president, and when he became the president, there was no war, there was a depression, so he fought the depression as if it was a war, quite foolhardily and to the detriment of millions. Once it became obvious that there was a war in Europe, it became his #1 priority to engage the United States in that war and to basically win glory forever. And for such a cynical, evil man, it is a great injustice that he essentially succeeded and is now lauded as one of the great men in history. Lincoln, he told lies and everything, but he wasn't nearly so deceitful as FDR. I don't get the impression that he fought the war to make himself great. I think he fought the war because he really thought, because he was a nationalist. There were a lot of people in the United States right around that time who were starting to realize the United States' potential as a nation state was Not only great, but dramatically more than any other state that existed. You know, Great Britain was the big state. The European states were really powerful, but there were always people in the United States who looked around and said, you know, really, in a couple years, there's every reason to expect that we would essentially be greater than any European state or any state anywhere. Basically, people who recognize this potential superpower status of the United States. And I think Lincoln was such a person, and that if you have that kind of hope or dream or envision that future for a country, to then be faced with the prospect of it breaking up into multiple states, that kind of just ruins your whole dream. And I think that that was part of it. And I think he also probably thought, well, I am the executive of the federal government. I am supposed to do what's in the interest of the federal government. And obviously, the federal government being torn into pieces is not in the interest of the federal government. So Joe Sobran, who was no fan of Lincoln, he's dead now, but as much of an anti-Lincoln revisionist as someone like Tom DeLorenzo was or is, you know, he said he considers him a tragic figure. He's somebody who thought he was doing something right, whereas someone like FDR is only thinking about himself, and the fact that millions of people died to, you know, bring that into reality completely doesn't matter to him at all. I don't think Lincoln felt that way. I don't think he was callous about the people who died. That's not excusing it. It's not excusing mass homicide to say that. Not only the soldiers, but the civilians. I remember Tom Woods saying it's kind of like we're in an age where everyone's victimized, and it's always like, oh, you know, the most minor indiscretions are considered tantamount to genocide if they have even the slightest bit of minority rights or racial rights. So, you know, if a Jewish guy was denied a job, then that's a sign of rampant anti-Semitism in the United States, even though Jews have had it better in the United States than they have anywhere else ever, even in Israel today. Yet, the 50,000 Southerners who were murdered, Southern civilians who were murdered by federal armies through starvation or directly, they have no constituency. And he was even quoting other historians, like, it is interesting. They're just like persona non grata in American history. Like, no tears are shed for them, except perhaps in the South. And this is one thing I will say, is that there is a geographic difference in how the Civil War is perceived in the United States. I'm from the North. All my family's from the North. I'm way in the North. Michigan is far from any southern state. And there is little to no sympathy for the South. On the other hand, in the South, that's not always the case. There's a lot of sympathy for the South in the South. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the states with the most signatures for secession are in the South. I think, and this is kind of ironic, I think I'll end on this little observation. The secession movement was really killed by the Republican Party, and I mean that in two ways. One is the obvious way in the 1860s. There's the rise of the Republican Party, and the fact that this demonstrated that, you know, Republicans can get elected completely in spite of the South. And this was showing to the South that, look, we don't have the majority in this society any longer. We can't look to politics within this state for our salvation because we're a minority. And that kind of led to secession. In a modern way, you know, after the war and during Reconstruction, the South became the so-called Solid South, solidly Democratic, by the way. And they were quite conservative in defending what they considered their way of life when it came to things like Jim Crow and whatever economic beliefs they had. And they were, in a sense, still not good nationalists. They were not good Americans. They resented America. They became the backward part of America. But after World War II, and I'm not saying because of World War II, but after World War II, the South and it wasn't right after, but the South switched to Republicans, and I think the Republican Party was very successful in basically convincing Southerners that, yeah, you want to conserve your way of life, your traditions, and the way to do that isn't by being a block of Southern states, it's by being in the Republican Party, because the Republican Party is the party of conservative social values and all the things that you value, we value, and so um, you shouldn't be in a geographic block of southern states. You should vote for just the National Republican Party. And so that conservative sentiment, and I don't really like conservative sentiment, but to the extent that it weakens the federal government, I think it's okay. Uh, that was kind of obfuscated, and it was channeled into a national party, and ironically it was the party that destroyed the South initially. And you know, the radical Republicans wanted to be much more vindictive uh, to the South than actually happened. Now, there's one thing that is very surprising about the American Civil War is when it was over, the federal government didn't go around and execute all the main rebels. You know, Jeff Davis was thrown in prison for a number of years, and then he was released without trial, without punishment. Robert E. Lee, nothing happened, which is amazing. In most countries where you have a civil war, especially a major one, you know, you don't have the losers basically have nothing happen to them. I mean, they hung like one man, and he deserved it. There were other people who deserved it too, and he was a foreigner, and that's probably why they did it. It's like, well, he's a foreigner, so we can get away with it. That is a very odd and I would say redeeming characteristic of the American Civil War. That they didn't go and, you know, murder everyone who had opposed Uncle Sam. But yeah, a lot of radical Republicans wanted that. A lot of radical Republicans wanted them all to be hung and wanted to hamstring the South more than already happened. So it's a little ironic that 2 generations later, Southerners are overwhelmingly Republican. And of course, the inverse happened with blacks. Blacks had always been Republicans, which they called the quote party of Lincoln, until about the same period where they switched to Democrats to help out their political machine, basically. That's a whole other story. So, Civil War, it's easy. I think it's wrong to just say it's one word. It's definitely not just slavery. If it's going to be one word, it's going to be ideology, and the main principle that we will be concerned with would be states' rights. However, the issue that they were worried about was slavery and tariffs and any other potential minority status issue that they might confront them. So the idea, and in contemporary political parlance, basically any kind of sympathy for or rejection of the South or rejection of the North is slandered and conflated with racism, which is blatantly absurd. The North was every bit as racist. Yes, slavery was not as widely practiced. It was direct slavery was pretty rare. Racism was rampant, and in some cases, in some ways, even worse. You know, I mean, that's debatable, but you know, one could argue that a Southerner who says, "Well, black is my property, and I value them as my property," they're obviously not equal to regular men; they're just slaves. But you know, they're part of our society. Versus many Northerners who are like, blacks should all go back to Africa or die. They should not be here ever under any circumstances. I don't know. we can have a debate about which one's worse, but they're both racist. And besides, the war was not fought for that reason. That was a retroactive justification after the war was almost over. The start was to maintain federal hegemony over the entire continent. And the drumming up of the war now, or the slander of secessionists as racist, that has the same aim. It's to keep the federal government in charge of this continent. And they have the money to pay plenty of historians to perpetuate that myth. So